Welcome to OU Informed, a podcast where Open University academics illuminate the issues and topics of our times. The fire that engulfed Grenfell Tower in North Kensington, West London, claimed the lives of 72 people, making it one of the UK's worst modern disasters. Scrutiny over the events leading up to the fire and how the emergency response itself was conducted has left many, not least of all the residents of the tower, feeling like justice hasn't been served. Steve Toombs is Professor of Criminology at the Open University and has long researched and written about the various ways in which state agencies, public organisations and private businesses generate crime and harm and how these might be mitigated. Since the fire in June 2017, Steve has participated in several documentaries on Grenfell Tower and spoken at over 30 public meetings across England, Scotland and Wales. So start with some background. What was the context surrounding Grenfell prior to the fire?
There are two key contexts, I think, for thinking about why the fire occurred and why it occurred, where it occurred. And I want to talk about each of them in turn, although in fact they're related, and hopefully that will become apparent as I talk about them. The first is to think about Grenfell Tower and the borough, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, in terms of inequality. So not each year, but fairly regularly, the government produces what it calls indices of multiple deprivation. And the indices of multiple deprivation basically chart levels of poverty or wealth, and they divide up populations into tenths. So you have the poorest 10%, where the government give you 1. That means the most deprived community. And the richest 10% gets a score of 10 on these indices of deprivation. And there are 7 different indices, and then there's an overall score which kind of determines the poverty or wealth of a particular community. And you can map these scores at different levels, different kind of areas. But the smallest area is something that the government calls the lower super output area. And that consists of about 1,500 people or 600 households. And so we can actually kind of drill down and look at Grenfell Tower and the wider estate, the Lancaster West estate, as a lower super output area of about 1,500 people. And what you find there is that on the index of multiple deprivation, that the community in and around the tower score 1, so they're the poorest 10% of people in England. These are scores for England. So we're dealing with a relatively poor population. The people in social housing, only 5 or 6 flats, I think, in the tower were privately owned. The rest were owned by the council or the TMO. I'll come to the TMO in a moment, Tenants Management Organisation. But we're talking about a poor community, absolutely poor community. But then there's another important context to think about, which is the area within which the tower sits. It sits within the political constituency of Kensington, which is the richest political constituency in England. And the broader area, the local authority area, the borough, the London borough, is Kensington and Chelsea, or the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, because of course Kensington Palace sits in the borough. And that's the richest borough in England. So we have a poor group of people in an area of incredible wealth, Kensington and Chelsea. And it's an area where the super rich live. It's an area where oil money from the Middle East has second homes. It's an area where Russian oligarchs, not least Roman Abramovich, who the owner of Chelsea, have second homes. So it's an area of immense wealth which most ordinary folk like us can't really imagine. So you have a poor group of people living in a very rich area, and so the borough, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, is also the most unequal borough in England. So it's across the country, it's the area of greatest relative poverty, relative deprivation, the most unequal place in the country. And in fact, it's not just the most unequal place in the country, but it's also a place which is getting less equal, where inequality is increasing. So in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire, the local MP, Emma Dent-Coad, collated existing data on poverty and trends on poverty and inequality in the area, and she looked at trends from 2010, 2017. And she found that during that period, the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer in the borough. And there's a really kind of stark indicator of that. So she found that the gap in life expectancy between the richest 10% in the borough and the poorest 10% in the borough had increased by 6 years over a 7-year period, which is quite stunning, right? So it's a very unequal borough where the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. So I think that's the first kind of contextual point to make about where the fire occurred. The second contextual point, which I think is related, is about the relationship between the local community, and by the local community I mean the residents of Grenfell Tower, but also of the estate in which it sat more widely, the Lancaster West estate. The local residents, social housing tenants, and the Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, the TMO. Now, the TMO was set up in Kensington and Chelsea, as they were set up in many other boroughs, as a management vehicle for the local authority. So local authorities across England and Wales set up TMOs to manage social housing in the borough. And so in a way it was a kind of administrative arrangement. There were financial implications with that. I'm not kind of saying that they were kind of set up with malign intentions. But one of the things that setting up TMOs did, because they're not formally part of the local authority, they're formally separate entities, is that it broke the link of accountability, broke the democratic relationship between local residents and the council, because these residents were no longer council tenants, they were social housing tenants. The relationship between the Kensington and Chelsea TMO and the residents in Grenfell Tower, and indeed social housing residents across the borough, was one which was never easy and became increasingly fractious. So fractious, in fact, that in 2010, the residents of Grenfell Tower set up something called the Grenfell Action Group. And the Grenfell Action Group was set up in order to have a collective voice in the hope that the TMO, and indeed the council to some extent, but the TMO would listen to their concerns, so to have a more effective voice rather than voicing those concerns individually.
In terms of having to almost voluntarily set up these kinds of groups to have voices heard, did the TMO have any kind of feedback loop from tenants, or was it just not effective? So much so that Grenfell residents found that they had to try and make that democratic link themselves.
TMOs historically had one or two representatives of local residents on their kind of management board. Indeed, Kensington and Chelsea did, but certainly in the context of Kensington and Chelsea, and indeed in other TMOs, there were concerns that these were kind of token representations, that the residents' voices weren't really being heard, or they were being articulated but not really being heard, listened to, or acted upon. Hence the formation of the action group. And the relationship between the Grenfell Action Group, the residents and the TMO continued to be a difficult one characterised by conflict. And this kind of came to a head in 2015 when the refurbishment of the tower began. Now, the refurbishment of the tower was a project of about £10 million. About half of that was spent upon internal refurbishment, so particularly central heating systems, new boilers, and so on and so forth, new heating systems. And just under half of it was spent on the external, the outside of the tower, and notoriously, of course, as we now know, on the cladding which proved to be flammable, and which turned the tower into a kiln, effectively, when the fire began on June the 14th, 2017. And the residents became increasingly concerned about the ways in which the refurbishment was being undertaken, and indeed about their health, safety and welfare. They thought that the refurbishment inside the flats was being done in a way which was dangerous. They thought that the placing of the boilers, the exposure of pipes and parts of the electrical system, they thought was making their flats and the building unsafe. And they indeed also brought in the trade union Unite also to help them articulate those concerns. But they weren't really listened to by the TMO. Interestingly, they weren't concerned at all about the cladding because they had no sense that flammable cladding was being put on the outside of the building to save £293,000, which was the saving that was made, as we found from an email that was released after the fire. The saving that was made when the shift from less flammable to a more flammable form of cladding, the decision was to make that shift was taken.
So is there evidence to suggest that the placement of boilers and fittings that they'd deemed to be unsafe could have been a cost-cutting exercise?
I'm not sure that the actual refurbishment was done in a way which was... It was clearly done in a way which was designed to kind of be of minimal cost. I mean, because of course, why would any organisation spend more than it had to spend? The TMO clearly knew about the concerns of the residents, not least because they were expressed regularly in a blog. And there's one very famous blog, or infamous blog now, which was posted by the Grenfell Action Group in November 2016, so 7 months before the fire, and it's headed KCTMO Playing with Fire. And it begins by saying, I mean, if I'd advise listeners to just to put KCTMO Playing with Fire Grenfell Action Group into a search engine and read the blog. It's probably about 1,500 words. It's chilling. It foretells the fire. It tells KCTMO and indeed the local authority, the council, that the residents believe that only after a serious fire and a multiple loss of life will their concerns be listened to. They predict that this will happen very soon. They call the TMO an unprincipled evil mafia who ride roughshod over the safety, health and welfare of the residents of the tower. And it's awful. It predicts what happened, not of course when happened, but it predicts what happened on that night.
There's already that sense of anger building, so much so that they're blogging about it and saying that they're not being listened to. And that was in the context of a Grenfell action group being in existence at that point. Even then, they tried to rebuild that democratic accountability and they still weren't being listened to.
The underlying sense of people in the tower, and this is only a personal opinion, but I tend to think that they're perfectly correct in this view, is that essentially they weren't really wanted in the borough. The council and the TMO would have much preferred to have had fewer rather than more social housing tenants, fewer rather than more blocks like Grenfell Tower. For one thing, they were an eyesore. People talked about the cladding being put up so the rich didn't have to look at a building which was so ugly, and I think there's clearly something in there. But also, of course, land values are so high in the borough because of the wealth in the borough that it's much better to raise down those tower blocks, clear off social housing, and put up luxury flats, luxury apartments, luxury accommodation. In 2016, the TMO sold off two what were former council houses, social housing houses, and the combined cost of those two houses was £4.6 million. So that gives you a sense, A, of the value of land and property in the borough, but it also gives you a sense. This is a council selling off two properties for £4.6 million. It's a council with the biggest reserves of any council in England, £270 million, and it's a council and a TMO that took a decision to save £293,000 to shift from less to more flammable cladding, which ultimately proved to be disastrous and led to the lives of 72 people being lost.
So I suppose there's a criticism there of a mentality of cost-cutting in general, and why should one of the richest boroughs be looking to sell off council assets? Do you think residents inhabited an almost pre-existing mainstream narrative that made it almost politically acceptable to cut corners where their welfare was concerned?
I mean, I think there are some other observations that are worth making in relation to the population in and around the tower, and how they were perceived and how they were treated. They were poor people in a rich borough. There were people where they were, living on land where actually there's much more money to be made by getting them off of that land. Significant numbers of people in the tower and in that northern part of the borough, the poor part of Kensington and Chelsea, were from black and minority ethnic populations. Significant numbers on the estate and in the tower hadn't actually been born in Britain, but had come to London seeking asylum. So there were, to be very crude about it, there were a lot of black and brown faces. These weren't white Britons. They didn't have many of the residents didn't have English as their first language, and they were kind of poor people, ripe for being stigmatised. Both just in the way in which popular culture stigmatises poor people as undeserving, just as in the way that the news and broadcast media stigmatise some poor people as being undeserving. And indeed, in a sense, I'm sure the links weren't made explicitly, but the relationship is between the residents of the tower and the Lancaster West Estate, the relationship between those people and the council and the TMO, I think are characterised by one word. Everything I've learnt about the relationships between those groups before the fire and indeed after the fire corroborates this. The relationships are characterised by contempt. Those poorer people, often non-white people, often non-English speaking people, they were treated with contempt. On the morning of the fire, about 4 a.m, as the tower burned, a 14-year-old lad was reported as saying he'd got out of the tower by then. He was a resident of Grenfell Tower. He was reported as saying, we're dying in there because we don't count. And that's quite right. I mean, that's why those people were in a tower block that was manifestly unsafe, and it's why their voices weren't listened to. They didn't count as much as the wealthier white English-speaking residents in the borough, and they were therefore stigmatised, and indeed some of them were killed because of attitudes towards poverty, because of class-based attitudes, and because of race-based attitudes, to be quite blunt about it. And the kind of contempt with which people were treated, which put them in such a dangerous position and led to 72 people losing their lives. That contempt has continued in the aftermath. It continued in the immediate aftermath when, apart from the emergency services, neither the local council nor central government was on the scene to provide any aid. It was 9 days after the fire that Theresa May stood up in Parliament and apologised. She said she apologised for the absence of the national and local state when people needed them most, because everything that was done for the residents in the first week or so after the fire was done by themselves. It was done by self-help, it was done by volunteers, it was done by third sector organisations. So that contempt continued. The contempt continued in the failure to rehouse people. A whole series of false promises made and commitments made by the TMO, by the council and by central government about when people would be permanently rehoused, while there were still about a third of the households, some 20 months after the fire, who are in temporary or emergency accommodation. It's quite incredible, really, in the richest borough in England. That contempt continued in terms of the promises that were made to local people about the say they would have over who chaired the public inquiry and about the terms of reference to the inquiry, when in fact a chair was imposed and terms of reference for the inquiry were imposed, which were very restrictive. About the location of the inquiry, so rather than be somewhere that local residents can easily access, the inquiry is in Holborn, on the other side of London, which is very convenient for lawyers and barristers, but not very convenient for families who have to travel 11 stops on the tube or make 2 changes on buses. After they talked about the deaths of their loved one, they articulate this. You know, we talk about the death of our father, brother, son, sister, and then we have to get on the bus, and with people coming home from work, and it's been a normal day for them. So that contempt, I think, has continued and is manifest in a whole series of ways in terms of how the bereaved and the survivors and local residents have been treated by virtually anybody in authority.
So why do you think it's taken so long to rehouse people? Is that due to a shortage of council housing in general, or was it perhaps a lack of priority that's indicative of this contempt that you mentioned?
There were about 200 households that needed rehousing, 204 I think. So look, that's not an insubstantial task for any local authority. If there were 204 properties just sitting waiting available that the council had access to. But clearly there weren't. So the council did have to engage in a process of buying up private property. But it's also clear that this hasn't been a priority for the TMO or the council. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, it dominated the Grenfell Tower fire, dominated council meetings, dominated business of the TMO. That changed relatively quickly. One of the concerns of the local residents and the survivors is that they've just simply been forgotten nationally and indeed locally. So I think the kind of priorities that were attached to rehousing simply kind of slipped off the agenda. But they're also, and you may or may not remember, they're also kind of, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, there were also stories about the council taking over luxury flats and moving residents in there. But other residents saying that this wasn't fair and that these people were getting access to luxury accommodation, and if they got access to the accommodation, they couldn't use the gym or the swimming pool that was part of the complex. So a lot of the kind of stigmatisation again around poverty, around inequality, a lot of that kind of kicked in popular consciousness and through the media. Now, whether those stories were true or not, I'm sure there were germs of truth to those rehousing attempts. But clearly that would have put the council on the back foot in terms of taking over, requisitioning effectively private accommodation. So it's been a very long and a very drawn out task.
So what do you think has come out of Grenfell in terms of, are we going to see councils paying more attention to their poorest constituents and improve accountability? Or do you think the government has paid a lot of lip service particularly around Grenfell, and they've sort of done the bare minimum in some respects, will they just sweep it under the carpet and just go back to business as usual?
There were, in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell, there were lots of kind of versions of people saying, people in authority, saying Grenfell changes everything, this changes everything, we need to think again about how we deal with think again about regulation, think again about fire safety, think again about health and safety of residents and local communities, think again about social housing and housing policy in general. I think it'll be wrong to say that nothing at all had changed, that there have been, for example, some shifts in housing policy. There were some shifts in attitudes towards fire safety, building regulations, although they haven't resulted in changes in policy or practice to date. On the other hand, I think very quickly local and central government resumed business as usual. Social housing tenants across the country continue to be at the bottom of local authorities' agendas, as far as I can see. One good index of that, or one good indicator of that, is the fact that you may or may not recall, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, local authorities across the UK, in fact, and indeed probably across parts of the world. I certainly recall hearing stories of this happening in Australia and parts of North America. Local authorities inspected buildings to see if they had similar kinds of flammable cladding on building on high-rise tower blocks, and indeed other high-rise non-residential blocks in their local area. Some 463 or 4, I think, similar types of flammable cladding were found on high-rise blocks, mostly residential, in England and Wales. The vast majority of those, and so there was commitments made to remove that cladding. Government said that it would support that financially. It said money will be no object. Money has been an object. It hasn't been forthcoming. The vast majority of those blocks not only have not had that cladding removed, but the removal of that cladding hasn't started, or even yet a start date hasn't been announced. So the attitude towards people, poorest people living up and down the country in those kinds of high-rise blocks that we see, on our way to school or work or on the train or the bus or in the car, we see them and don't really take much notice of them for the most part. That attitude hasn't really changed. Those people have been left in manifestly dangerous conditions with the kind of psychological stress of knowing that, of kind of the images of what happened at Grenfell Tower, thinking that this could happen to them. I've heard residents in Salford, Greater Manchester, articulate these concerns directly about problems of sleeping after Grenfell in their own tower blocks. Those people have just been left, really. So I think fundamentally attitudes haven't really changed. They're very, very difficult to shift.
So from what you said, much of the response was around a sort of almost forensic examination of policies in place, particularly around fire safety procedures, materials used, were regulations followed, weren't they followed? But is there much being done to address the underlying cultural and social factors, and perhaps the part that inequality has played?
The debate around the terms of reference of the public inquiry is very interesting for me because on the one hand there are attempts, particularly by authority, to narrow down the terms of reference and to have that focus on very, very technical issues, the nature of the cladding, the advice from the fire service, the stay put advice, some building regulations, the ways in which fire safety was inspected. Pretty kind of technical, minute policy detailed issues. On the other hand, many of the local residents, many of the kind of campaign groups around what happened wanted to broaden that out, broaden the terms of reference out, to take account of long-term attitudes, in a sense, on the part of central and local authority to relatively to poor people, to open that out in terms of housing policy, access to decent housing, and indeed democratic accountability at local and national levels. And interestingly, the voices that weren't heard before Grenfell weren't heard after Grenfell because the terms of reference were pretty narrow, and so the more big inquiry has been pretty much around technical issues. And look, those technical issues aren't irrelevant. It clearly far fewer people would have died in the tower that night had the original cladding, the cladding which was originally planned to be put on the outside of the building, if that had gone up instead of the more flammable cladding, far fewer lives would have been lost. So these things aren't irrelevant. The stay put policy by the fire service clearly needs review. It's clearly been called into question by what happened at Grenfell Tower and indeed Lakanal House in 2009, a similar but much smaller scale fire. But actually, the real issue is a very simple one. I mean, those lives wouldn't have been lost if people had been listened to. Those lives wouldn't have been lost if someone in authority had read the Playing with Fire 2016 blog and acted upon it. So the question and the problem remains the same, which is, how do we create structures whereby those at the bottom of social hierarchies, whether they're in local communities, whether they're in workplaces or whatever, how do we build structures where those voices are taken seriously, where those voices are listened to, where those voices are acted upon? And that really means, how do we create a more equal society? I mean, it's a very basic question. The questions that, it was inequality that produced Grenfell, in my opinion, and that inequality hasn't at all been broached after Grenfell.
So following the fire, we've heard a lot of terms like corporate manslaughter, slightly more provocative terms like social murder. What do we mean when we're using these terms, and what sort of legislation is coming into effect where Grenfell's concerned?
In the aftermath of the fire, there was discussion about what possible criminal charges might follow, if any criminal charges, in order to bring the guilty to account, as often happens after an atrocity of this kind. And the key piece of legislation which was invoked, being talked about, was something called the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act, and that was introduced in the UK in 2007, and it came into force on the 1st of April 2008. And that act was designed explicitly to bring medium and large organisations or complex organisations to legal account following deaths, often in workplaces, but also deaths in public settings. And it covered almost all corporate bodies, that's private companies, but it also covered local councils, health trusts, TMOs, and so on and so forth. So, within a couple of months of the fire, the Metropolitan Police, Cressida Dick, head of the Met, announced that her force was collecting evidence to consider possible charges of corporate manslaughter, or to recommend to the CPS charges of corporate manslaughter against the council, against the tenants management organisation, and against a company called Rehousing, which was the main contractor which undertook the refurbishment of the tower, and I think 7 or 8 other companies working with Rehousing, smaller subcontractors. There were about 60 companies involved in the refurbishment. So that announcement was made something like July or August of 2017, a couple of months after the fire. We know that there are about 200 police officers in the Met working on compiling, sorting through that evidence. I had said to me around Christmas 2017, about 6 months after the fire, that the Met reckoned it would have to work through about 30 million documents before it could pass over charges to the CPS. Now, a document might be a substantial document, or it might just be an email, right? But there's 30 million of these things to work through. And Cressida Dick has already said that if there are to be any charges or recommendations of charges to the CPS, that they won't be, we shouldn't expect any news until about 2020. In fact, under the Act, since it's been introduced, there have been 26 convictions. They've all actually been with one exception, they've all been of small companies, so no medium or large-sized company certainly has ever been successfully prosecuted. Those prosecutions tend to take 4, 5, 6 years to get to court. In all cases, they've resulted in a fine. The highest fine levied on any company to date has been £500,000, although there is a £20 million ceiling, so any of those organisations could be fined £20 million. But certainly in the case of the local authority or TMO, where does it get £500,000 or £20 million? It gets £500,000 or £20 million ultimately from its social housing residents or from its council taxpayers. So it generates that money through local people. And of course, if it's generating money through local people to pay a fine, the local people hardest hit by that are the poorest people, or the people most dependent upon social housing or the services of the council. So in a sense, the gruesome irony of any successful prosecution of public bodies following the Grenfell Tower fire will be that the kinds of people who are killed by the fire will be the kinds of people who are hardest hit. So There may be convictions under the Act. I personally think it's unlikely, but I don't have a crystal ball. But they will be unprecedented. As I said, there's been no large organisation successfully prosecuted under the Act. But if there are prosecutions and convictions, they won't represent justice. And they also won't touch, because the Act explicitly doesn't allow for this, explicitly excludes this, they won't touch any of the senior individuals in the council or the TMO, who many of the local residents feel are personally responsible for the 72 lives that were lost that night.
So what would justice look like for the residents of Grenfell, and indeed for other survivors of similar tragedies, particularly where public bodies should be held to account?
I think justice would partly look like prosecutions under various pieces of legislation, corporate manslaughter charges of the public bodies. There could be criminal charges of gross negligence manslaughter of senior individuals, although they haven't yet been considered as far as I know. There may also be charges under health and safety legislation, fire safety legislation, and all of those are ways in which the criminal justice system tries to deliver justice. That's what it does, right? Through prosecutions or convictions. Actually, I think, and I can't speak for the residents, but I know that some of them would say this as well. Justice doesn't look like the criminal justice system, doesn't look like prosecutions, although some of the residents do want prosecutions, of course. Justice looks like this not happening again to other people. And for this not to happen to other people, for this not to happen to other residents of social housing, then there has to be a change in the way in which local authorities and TMOs deal with their tenants and deal with local people, so that justice looks like greater accountability, greater local democracy, greater equality or reductions of levels of inequality and poverty.
Share your thoughts on this episode's topic by using the hashtag OUInformed. This episode was brought to you by the OU social media engagement team and produced and presented by Greg Harwood. We'll see you next time.